Utah has a plan to deal with homelessness, lining up behind President Trump's belief that people should not be allowed to sleep on the streets. State officials say they're preparing to pull more than 1,000 homeless people out of Salt Lake City and into a sprawling campus on the outskirts of town. Supporters call it a place where people can get the services they need. Critics call it a detention camp. So what exactly is this campus, this camp?
So for now, this is still in its planning stages. It hasn't been built, but it is definitely an effort to kind of operationalize the president's executive order from the summer, which said that overwhelmingly homeless people are suffering from mental illness or addiction, and overwhelmingly they should be put into long-term institutional care.
Okay, but what?
We are not going to listen to the status quo where we say that it's acceptable to leave our loved ones to die in squalor and despair and addiction and untreated mental illness on the streets. And so we want to bring people indoors and help them heal.
Clancy alluding to how the Utah Homeless Services Board recommended in September that the state establish a transformative services-based homeless campus that's now tentatively set to be located on the outskirts of the Salt Lake City International Airport. The recommendations call for part of it to be a substance treatment facility where entry and exit are not voluntary. Where entry and exit are not voluntary.
We're all familiar with the haunting images of the concentration camps of World War II. The cruelty of places like Auschwitz are widely studied and known primarily because millions of lives were lost and irreparably damaged by the terror that ensued within their walls. This could also be because of a predisposition in Western cultures to only focus on the events and history of places in the West. But the history of concentration camps extends back to the late 19th century when two inventions, barbed wire and the automatic rifle, made it possible for small numbers of guards to control large populations. So today we'll be diving into this troubling corner of world history to answer the questions: why did concentration and internment camps start, and under what circumstances are they still being used on civilian populations around the world to this day? In 1895, long before the battles of World War I and World War II, the then Spanish Governor General of Cuba, Arsenio Martinez Campos, introduced a new term to the realm of modern warfare: reconcentración. In an article for Smithsonian Magazine, journalist Andrea Pitzer details Campos' letter to the Spanish Prime Minister, in which she expressed concern that the fighting from local rebel forces would never cease as long as they were getting aid from civilians. He proposed that civilians and fighters alike could be rounded up and kept behind barbed wire in Spanish-controlled camps in order to bring an end to the conflict. But the man who had introduced the concept of concentration camps to the world balked at implementing them on the island, saying in the letter, "I cannot, as the representative of a civilized nation, be the first to give the example of cruelty and intransigence." However, after he was recalled from the island and sent to other foreign posts, his successor, Valeriano Weyler, ominously nicknamed the Butcher, did implement the policy on the island. The resulting carnage led to the death of over 150,000 people in Cuba and earned Weyler a reputation in US newspapers as a brutal tyrant. Yet Weyler maintained after the conflict was over that his reconcentrado policy was merited. On May 3, 1898, he's quoted in the New York Times saying, "I was rigorous, just, and resolute. I had a problem to solve by the rules of military science. I did not originate the scheme for reconcentration. If it were mine, I would avow it. The scheme was the upshot of war, the growth of abnormal conditions, rather than a deliberate plan. It was rife in the time of Campos. I am a soldier, and I have never considered it my duty to wrap up my rifle balls in wadding lest I hurt my enemy." Weyler's unrelenting policy of brutality would have far-reaching effects even after the conflict ended. An August 1910 article, also from the New York Times, notes that Weyler's actions in Cuba served as a catalyst for the Spanish-American War of 1898. It describes pitiable and inhumane conditions in which civilians were collected into camps surrounded by deep ditches and barbed wire fences on all sides, with little attempts made to feed the incarcerated populations held in the camps. This resulted in widespread deaths. According to the article, these first concentration camps cost Spain about $200 million, 18,000 lives lost through fever and rebel bullets, as well as 14 pieces of artillery and more than 1,000 rifles. Weyler's tenure in Cuba had deadly consequences, not just for the Cuban people, but for the world. Despite the fact that he was largely lambasted in the foreign press for starting the world's first concentration camps, numerous countries mirrored his strategy in the decades that followed. When combined, barbed wire and the automatic rifle made it possible for a relatively small group of guards to control a large prisoner population. As a result of these inventions and Weyler's policies in Cuba, the use of concentration and internment camps spread in subsequent wars, and the practice was adopted by many nations long before the infamous camps of World War II. Even countries like Britain and the US that had remained outwardly critical of Weyler's camps in Cuba began to use them as a wartime strategy. And just as barbed wire and early automatic rifles made reconcentration possible in Cuba in 1895, even deadlier weapons like gas chambers made these camps more fatal. What began in Cuba in 1895 unleashed a new systematic strategy of war that meant more innocent civilians than ever could be detained, mistreated, or even killed in the name of military action. This strategy continues to be a threat to this day. And yet the history of concentration camps also tells a story of how we think of war in general, namely the role of civilians, who can be used, tortured, or killed in order to win a larger conflict. It broadens the definition of who can be enlisted in and used to win a war, and it's a threat that leaves no one safe during conflict.